All right, so why don't we make a start? Um, we will have people trickling in, I think, in the first few minutes of the call, but we will make a start for the sake of time, I think. So let me start my video. I'm Robin Hamaker-Taylor. Thank you for joining us this morning. Good morning. This is the third and final training session on the climate risks and the TCFD framework organized by the CDC. So I will hand over to Maya at first to walk us through the housekeeping for the call and then get started with the agenda.
Great, thank you, Robin. Welcome, everyone. So today's training is scheduled to last 1.5 hours, including the Q&A. Please place your screen in presenter mode or off of full screen mode to ensure that you can see both the camera and the slides. There will be a group exercise where you will be provided with 3 links via the chat box to answer a set of questions, and your active participation is requested. That being said, please remain on mute until the group exercise portion of the training. The recording and the slides will be available to download after this meeting. And for the Q&A, please submit them in the Zoom chat box below at any time, and it will take place at the end of the webinar. Thank you, Robin.
Thanks, Maya. If you move on. So, as I said, my name is Robin Hamaker-Taylor. I'm a climate risk consultant here at Acclimatise, and as with the first training, I will be joined by my colleague John Firth, who's the co-founder and CEO of Acclimatise and a climate risk expert with extensive experience in the field. Next slide, please. This webinar is the third and final training, as I said, of CDC's webinars on TCFD and climate risks. So some of you have joined us over the last couple of weeks for the first training, which provided a general overview of climate risks and the TCFD framework and how financial institutions can get started on using it. Today, we'll wrap up this series of webinar trainings and look at climate-related risks and opportunities, as well as the TCFD framework for African financial institutions. Next slide. Before we get into the training sessions, we wanted to share the learning objectives again for today. What we want you to come away from this training session with is first an increased awareness and understanding of what key climate-related risks and opportunities are in your region. We also want you to come away with an improved understanding of how climate risk governance is taking shape in your region, and which is the piece on essentially why you should act on climate risks and the TCFD framework. We also want you to come away with an improved understanding of how your peers are getting started on TCFD action, and as well as the important networks emerging around the TCFD framework for financial institutions like you. And finally, we want you to leave this training with some early steps you can take on your TCFD journey, which is the how you can get started piece. Next slide, please. The sessions we have planned for you have a similar structure as webinar 1, which is to say that they follow the what, the why, and the how elements of climate risk and TCFD. So I will lead the climate risk and opportunities section, and my colleague John will lead the governance section. As Maya mentioned, there will be this group exercise toward the end of the webinar, and that should give you a chance to really start to think through some of the actions and early decisions that you need to take in order to start taking action on TCFD. So I will lead that, and John will help out with the discussion around that. So with that exercise, we really do encourage your active participation and engagement. And a final word to say before we get started is that along with, as we saw with webinar 1, apart from the content covered in this agenda, this slide deck includes recommended readings for the Africa region, and also includes a table summarizing relevant networks of financial institutions who are getting started on TCFD like you. So please make use of these other resources that are included in the slide deck. Next slide. So let's get started and move into the first session. Next slide. So I'll take a minute here to quickly recap on the definitions of physical and transition climate risks that we talked about in the first training. Physical risks from climate change arise from the extreme weather events or incremental shifts in climate patterns. Incremental shifts include changes in precipitation, sea level rise, and things like rising mean temperatures. So in TCFD language, incremental shifts are known as chronic risks. Extreme events include flood, extreme rainfall, landslides, things like wildfire, extreme heat and drought, as well as cyclones. And in TCFD language, these are known as acute risks. Transition risks arise from the process of adjustment towards a net zero or a low carbon economy, and they're caused by changes in policy, changes in legal and regulatory frameworks, as well as shifts in market preferences or technologies. Examples here include tightening energy efficiency standards for domestic and commercial buildings, renewable energy or emissions targets, or changes in relative pricing of alternatives, which are arising from rapid technological changes, which include things like electric vehicles or renewable energy. Next slide. So starting with physical risks first, we have pulled a climate summary profile for several countries around the African continent based on where we think you are located and where you operate. It's important for us to flag here that physical climate risks are highly variable in space or in location, and that the country profiles that we are showing here may mask important nuances between different locations in the country, different physical risks that manifest in different parts of the country. We also want to flag that looking at 4 countries across the continent of Africa can't begin to fully summarize physical risks across the continent. But that said, we think the profiles that we're going to share with you should give you a flavor of physical risks and how they're manifesting in different parts of Africa. Another caveat we want to just flag in the beginning of this session is with these physical risk profiles, the timeframes are sometimes looking out to the 2050s and beyond. And this is because of the publicly available literature that we used essentially to create these climate summaries. They are based on climate projections out to the 2050s. Climate modeling, to be clear, for near term, such as 5 to 10 years, is still being developed. You can access climate model outputs for 2030s. It's just that the publicly available literature we used here, which is readily available, use longer term projections. So the thing is if you're concerned about understanding impacts in the much nearer term, around 5 to 10 years, we want to just have you recall the trajectory that Anu talked us through when she was talking through the climate warming that we're already seeing in the first training. So we know that we've already reached about 1 degree of warming above pre-industrial levels, and we're already seeing more frequent and extreme event changes and more frequent and extreme events with this 1 degree. So due to the lag in the climate system and historical emissions, we know that even if we stopped all emissions tomorrow, there will still be a 1.5 or 2 degree warming above pre-industrial levels by the 2030s or 2040s. So in other words, a certain amount of climate change is locked in. So when we're thinking about the next 5 to 10 years, where we'll experience the same or similar amount of overall warming that we've already seen, so around 1 degree, what we can do is look to recent incremental changes or extreme events as a sort of clue as to what will happen in the near term time frame. That's to say we can essentially expect more of the same events that are currently happening. And there are new modeling techniques such as correlation analysis emerging, which can help you look back and explore those. Okay, so moving to Kenya. Current important physical hazards being experienced here include severe drought, which is a serious threat to food security. So we saw in 2019, 1 million people were at risk of starvation due to droughts, as it has caused things like food price inflation. Climate projections for Kenya show that temperatures are due to rise, heat waves will get longer, and dry spells will get longer as well. At the same time, certain periods of the year will see increased rainfall, of close to 30% more rain, which will likely increase flood. And in terms of impacts, agriculture will clearly be impacted, which includes reduced yields, heat stress for livestock, and damages to crops and land. And importantly for business and the economy, droughts and extreme heat will impact Kenya's hydropower production, which accounts for around half of domestic energy production. Hydro production is reduced by up to 40% in drought years we've seen, and this leads to persistent power outages as well as associated economic losses. Estimates show that Kenya can expect potential losses of 2.6 of GDP annually through 2030 as a result of climate change as well. So there's quite a strong potential for economic impacts there. Next slide, please. Moving to Nigeria, physical risks here in recent years have been essentially around extreme flooding. We've seen hundreds of thousands of people displaced in recent years from floods, and saltwater intrusion from sea level rise is also a current problem. In the future, Nigeria can expect increases in temperature and extreme heat, as well as increasing sea level rise. And impacts include crop failures and reduced yields, which also help contribute to food insecurity. I think we're also expecting to see reduced river flow, which can contribute to reductions in hydropower as well, similar to Kenya. Estimates for the economic impact of climate change suggest that GDP could reduce by 1.6% around 2030 and up to 5% by 2050 due to climate hazards. Next slide. Looking at physical risks in South Africa, these in recent times have included cycles of severe droughts in some regions, coupled with severe floods in other regions. In recent years, we probably all recall the droughts of the Western Cape. The province there was forced to set strict water restrictions, including curbs on irrigation, as dam levels dropped to below 20%. And this had a direct effect on agriculture and food production, as well as ripple effects across the entire country. So in the province, the Western Cape province, more than 5 billion rand was lost, largely due to the drought. And this matters for South Africa as a whole because the Western Cape contributes significantly to the national GDP, and GDP during this time period grew quite slowly over those severe drought years. South Africa's wine and grape production is an example, and production was down 15% due to the droughts, which led to a production shortfall of around 170 million liters of wine, and also increased wine prices. In the future, South Africa can expect temperature increases and continued cycles of flood and drought, as well as sea level rise. And apart from agricultural impacts, other industries such as tourism may decline as climate change is also impacting. We're seeing impacts on wildlife and wildlife parks as well. Next slide. And moving to Morocco, current impacts include temperature increases, declining precipitation, and increased frequency and intensity of droughts and heat waves. In the future, we can expect to see increased drought. It's a particular concern there, as is sea level rise and coastal flooding. Similar to other African countries mentioned, the agricultural sector here will take a hit. Water resources are expected to decrease, along with potential economic impacts due to that, and coastal zones and fisheries will be impacted as well. Next slide. So a quick look at some of the financial impacts that financial institutions are thinking about due to some of the physical risks we talked about. In Kenya, we see bankers expecting credit defaults due to climate hazards and impacts. In Nigeria, banks have noted recently that climate risks can lead to reduction in investment return and premature asset write-downs. And in South Africa, there's a growing understanding about a general overall understanding about the financial materiality of climate risks. Next slide. So turning now to transition risks and first looking at Kenya, we see that in Kenya's published NDC, the government has made commitments to increase its greenhouse gas emissions. reduce its greenhouse gas emissions, and has other plans to increase its renewable energy even further with recent announcements there. NDCs are a country's nationally determined contribution as part of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement requires each party to participate, communicate, and maintain its NDCs. So it's important to note that NDCs listed on this slide and the following slides, commitments there will be ratcheted up as there's essentially a requirement to publish successive NDCs. So while there are current targets of as part of a country's NDC, there will be stricter targets in the future, and this means it's essentially time to get started now on managing that coming transition risk that we can all see coming. So I want to turn briefly to the graph on the slide. This shows Kenya's Energy Transition Index score, and the ETI was developed by the World Economic Forum, and it helps indicate how ready a country is for the energy transition. It's a sort of quick fire way to gauge transition risk or transition readiness. And you can see that Kenya is just in the leapfrogging quadrant, which is on the bottom right of the graph. In future, to reduce its emissions further and meet those targets it has, Kenya will likely look to the waste and transport sectors, which could lead to further transition risks there. Next slide. Turning to South Africa, the country's also made commitments in its NDCs around reducing greenhouse gas emissions. A couple of other really interesting policy shifts have happened more recently, though, in South Africa, and these are really driving transition risk in the energy and carbon intense sectors there. The first is the carbon tax. This was established in 2019, and its immediate impact, however, though, is likely to be limited. As you may know, there are current exemptions for up to 95% of emissions during its first phase, which runs from 2019 to 2022. What the country's trying to do is minimize the impact in the first phase of the policy on essentially the price of electricity and energy intensive sectors, which include mining, iron, and steel, though impacts could be seen in the second phase. Another policy shift, which is really worth highlighting here for South Africa, is the integrated resource plan, which was finally updated in 2019 after sort of, its much anticipated release. The plan reduces the role of coal compared to previous planning, and I think the previous plan was in 2010, and it increases the adoption of renewables as well as gas, actually. It aims to decommission over 35 of the 42 gigawatts currently operating of coal-fired power capacity. That's really important to note. In terms of market shifts we're seeing in South Africa, these include the general decline in costs for renewables like solar and wind in recent years, which are making these increasingly viable alternatives to coal-fired power. And we're seeing mining companies as well divesting they're facing pressure from investors and divesting themselves their coal assets. And also another thing to point out here in South Africa is that coal is now increasingly understood as having health impacts, and there's a rising sentiment among the population to really move away from it, which I think is kind of captured here in this Bloomberg headline from 2019. Next slide. Turning to transition risks in Morocco. So Morocco has turned itself around, interestingly, in recent years, and much of the energy transition is already underway here. The country has a wide range of greenhouse gas emissions targets, renewable energy targets, and plans to reduce fossil fuel subsidies. Drivers of the transition risk here have been really strong political will, and the government has also taken good advantage of the falling sort of cost of solar technologies. This image here is the largest concentrated solar farm in the world, and it's located here in Morocco. In the future, the country will continue to roll out renewables, and it's assigned agreements linking export of some of its solar energy to European countries, for example. The country also looks poised to transform its transport sector in years to come with published plans to support public transport. Next slide. Okay, so that was a quick sort of overview of physical risks and transition risks that we're seeing around different parts of Africa. We want to turn to opportunities for the last bit of this session. So TCFD calls for analysis of climate-related opportunities alongside climate-related risks. We touched on in webinar one, you can begin to look for investing and lending needs across various types of clients as part of your TCFD response. And it's also worth stressing here that financial institutions can be ahead of the curve of both physical and transition risks, which are emerging and already there. They can get ahead by already allocating capital towards resilient and low carbon technologies, sectors, or infrastructure. This slide here shows examples stemming of opportunities stemming from physical risks, as well as those stemming from transition risks. It's not meant to be an exhaustive list, but it can give you an idea of types of emerging opportunities, and you can use this framework to think about where and what climate-related opportunities might be. So you can look for opportunities across a wide range of clients who are at various stages of managing risks. You can look at clients who are managing current risks, clients who are responding to new and emerging risks, or clients that are adapting to broader market shifts or transitions. Next slide. Thinking about what types of climate-related opportunities are available and the size of the market in African countries. In 2016, the World Bank estimated that to tackle climate change, African countries need $5 to $10 billion a year, and that's in order to adapt to a 2°C warming world. But this could be as high as 20 to 50 billion by mid-century, and close to 100 billion in the case of a 4°C warming world. So the World Bank's Africa Climate Business Plan flags overarching sort of categories of priority climate resilient and low carbon initiatives to invest in Africa. And these broad categories include investment needs in natural and human capital. So this could include nature-based solutions and infrastructure, as well as social infrastructure. And this plan also flags investment needs in low carbon energy sources and plans to scale that up, which include things like geothermal and hydro. And it also flags investment in data and information needed to promote climate resilient investment. Next slide. So this slide shows, thinking again about opportunities, shows results from the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, their 2020 Global Renewables Outlook Study. And the figures here show the cumulative renewable energy investment needs from 2016 to 2050 that will result in the full deployment of the renewable energy roadmap options in Africa. Sorry, the sub-Saharan African region in particular. So IRENA in this study ran two energy scenarios, which is the first is the planned energy scenario, which is pulling from what countries have listed in their NDCs as of 2019. And they also ran a transforming energy scenario, which is a more ambitious but still realistic energy transformation pathway. And it's based largely on renewable energy sources and steadily improved energy efficiency. So we can see that there's an estimated over 1.2 trillion US dollars in investment needs according to current NDCs on the left, but a potential 3.6 trillion of investment needed if more ambitious targets were assumed. So to the left, we flag some of the areas in Africa where IRENA has identified as having high resource and cost-effective power generation for both photovoltaic solar and concentrated solar power. Together, these amount for over 2,000 megawatts of solar and over 1,000 megawatts of wind projects. And IRENA predicts that the Africa overall has the potential to install 310 gigawatts of clean renewable power, which is essentially half of the continent's total electricity generation capacity to meet a quarter of its energy needs by 2030. So there's massive potential here. And we also kind of need to bear in mind too that around 48% of the continent's population currently still do not have access to power. African countries need power to become resilient, and renewable energy, therefore, is both a sort of transition and adaptation related opportunity. So final word here is that we know from other studies in other regions that the transition to a low carbon and resilient economy can really be accelerated by the help of strong private sector engagements. So it's not just up to governments to meet these investment needs. We see increasing and well-developed business cases for addressing climate change and pursuing sustainable growth. And we're seeing positive returns on investment and improved operational resilience. So there's essentially a real role for financial institutions like you to play in building climate resilience across Africa. Next slide. Okay, so this concludes the first first session of this training, which we reviewed climate risks for key African markets. We also saw that key physical climate hazards include drought, flooding, and extreme heat, as well as sea level rise. These are already impacting households and businesses, and pose a serious threat to the current development that's taken place, as well as potential to develop the continent further. With transition risks, we've seen policy and market changes underway, and these are impacting the energy sector and thermal power and coal in particular. Other carbon intense sectors, including mining, are also at risk. And we have seen that a couple countries that we looked at are also looking to transform their transport sectors as well, so that's one to look out for. We see that climate risks are increasingly understood by financial institutions across the continent as material, and they're increasingly associated with potential credit defaults and value corrections. And finally, I touched on climate-related opportunities stemming from both physical and transition risks, and these include renewable energy as a really strong standout area to have a very strong investment potential across the continent. Next slide. Okay, so now we will move into the second session, which is the piece on why African financial institutions should get started on analyzing climate risk and engaging with TCFD. And for that, I'll hand over to my colleague, John.
Okay, thank you, Robin, and good morning, everybody. And just to emphasize, I mean, what Robin has been showing there is some of the range of risk and opportunity, both related to transition and to physical changes in our climate. It's a snapshot of what's happening, but I think the important thing is to now context this against what is happening around the world, including in Africa, on how financial institutions, the financial services sector generally, and corporates are beginning to address this and the frameworks they're using. So one of the things we're going to be talking about quite a lot now is the TCFD recommendations. And the important thing about this is getting started on TCFD and using that as your base potentially places you in a very competitive position. It provides greater capacity and capability to respond to regulatory pressures, which are beginning, and also to investor mandates and requests for more disclosure and more information. And also, it helps you understand and begin to appreciate the effects on your business model arising from changing market and consumer demands and conditions, because what is inevitable is the effect of climate change, both transition and physical risk, is your business will change in the coming years, even if you haven't experienced those changes now. So go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to just take you through some of the main drivers for needing to pick up something like the TCFD recommendations as your base on which you deliver and look at your business model. And I think that's an important point, that whilst TCFD uses the word disclosure, actually that's an output from something. What TCFD really is a process of exploring your business model and is your business model fit for purpose in a world that is changing around you? So whilst say disclosure is the output, the real objective is to explore your business model. When we look at the three key drivers for this, we can see there are market-led initiatives. One of them obviously is the Tcfd framework, but there are others out there, but we will concentrate on Tcfd. There's regulation oversight. This is becoming clear that a number of financial regulators and central banks are moving on this, and we'll give you some examples of that in a moment. And finally, there are stakeholder pressures and expectations. Stakeholders, particularly some of the investor groups and shareholder action groups, are demanding action and asking questions. And we're also getting action down on the ground from customers and clients as well. It's also important to recognize that a need for a climate risk analysis and assessment is being driven by the social impacts we're seeing, the wider environmental impacts, and increasingly some of the geopolitical impacts as well. And certainly Africa is affected, particularly on the geopolitical side. Now to the next slide, please. In terms of emerging oversight, in terms of what's happening in the regulatory area and action and governance, one of the interesting things that came out very recently last year was from the South African National Treasury publishing a draft report, technical paper, Financing a Sustainable Economy. And in that paper, what they've done, which was drawn up by a working group of all the key financial service regulatory agencies and industry associations across Africa, so South Africa. So it's a very wide-ranging group of your peers and your regulators. What they did was look at how can they improve stakeholder understanding of the extent of financial institutions' exposure to climate risk, and then came up with some recommendations, and particularly in the context of co-developing and adopting technical guidance, standards and norms for use across all financial sectors, so the step towards regulation. And importantly, the use of science-based methodologies and the incorporation of the recommendations of the TCFD. So whilst there are a whole number of initiatives around the world, actually they all draw back to TCFD. So the important thing for you to pick up on is look at TCFD recommendations first and use that as your base point for exploring this. Go to the next slide, please. Another interesting regulatory or quasi-regulatory process ongoing is that a large number of the central banks across the world, I think there's over 60 now, are engaged in something called NGFS, which is the Network for Greening the Financial System. It's a very interesting organization, and we've listed out the current NGFS membership across Africa. It's perhaps noticeable that Eastern Africa is not well represented or not represented yet on this. But what is happening is these are central banks who are listening, watching, sharing ideas and thoughts, and particularly picking up from some of the actions that are already be commencing, particularly in Europe, with some of the central banks there, where we are very, very close to formal regulation on not just disclosure, but on the business model, and particularly using TCFD approach. So for example, stress testing from the Bank of England, disclosure requirements, making it mandatory that a board member, director level, owns climate change and reports back to the Bank of England on this. So the key thing here is that whilst banks in Africa may not yet have moved to formal regulation, they're sitting around the table with banks that are doing that, and they are listening, they are sharing, and they are beginning to explore ideas. So this is something that's very upfront with your central banks, even if it's not percolated down into regulation within your own countries. Next slide, please. Turning to stakeholder action, I think we can, we've already seen actions taking place, and there's two examples here with Standard Bank and First Rand. And again, this is something that's really moved forward very quickly over the last 2 to 3 years, partly tied into TCFD recommendations, but also a growing awareness amongst a whole group of shareholders, which are very diverse, about the risk of climate change, not just to their lives, to their homes, to their businesses, but also to their investments as well. So in both situations here, under pressure from activists, organizations have actually had to take different actions themselves. So shareholder pressure has resulted in banks really beginning to think about the disclosure process, the assessment process, the effect on their business models. Now, it's far better that a bank is proactive and ahead of the curve rather than responding to direct shareholder pressure, clearly, which forces it into actions that perhaps may not have been against its own timescale. Next slide, please. We're also seeing, in terms of stakeholder expectations, obviously the role of the development banks, multilateral and development banks across Africa is very important, particularly in terms of de-risking investments, supporting with technical assistance, but also as the direct investment, providing credit lines and directly to business operations. A number of development banks are already very active in this space in the context of climate change. Some of these are already signatories to Tcfd, so they're under a requirement themselves to report, and we've listed out some examples here, including obviously CDC, who are the sponsors today, the International Finance Corporation, KfW from Germany, European Investment Bank, and Swedfund from Sweden. There are others who may not be signed up to TCFD, but nevertheless are taking this very seriously. In fact, all the multilateral development banks sit on a group where they are exploring how do they integrate climate change, transition and physical into all their banking decisions and their investment decisions. So to give you an example, the European Investment Bank has stated right from the top of the bank that its bank will only invest in Paris-aligned projects and opportunities, and it will use the European Union taxonomy to decide whether or not a project should be invested in. So they're taking a very strict and hard line, which will translate into the way they work with you as partners as well. I'd also like to mention other banks that onto this, the African Development Bank is looking at climate change very seriously and starting to understand how does it influence its work going forward. And also the Islamic Development Bank. We know the Islamic Development Bank is actually screening every single investment project at lending risk stage to understand the physical risk it impacts on its investment. So even though the project sponsor may not be aware of it, that is happening within the development bank. Go to the next slide, please. And there's also action taking place within your peers, and by this I mean your global peers. Across the world, there are now just over 1,000 supporters signed up to TCFD, which is once you sign up, that declares you will report, you will assess, you will disclose. And together they have market capitalization of over $12 trillion, and that's increasing. Whilst there are only, at the moment, there are 9 financial institutions in Africa that are signatories, what's important to think about is that there are actually 595 banks and investors globally. And those banks and investors include all the major commercial investment banks across the world, who are all also very active in Africa. And they'll be your partners as well. So whilst the number of banks in Africa may be limited at the moment and not signed up to TCFD. The organisations you work with are, and that clearly will have an influence inevitably on your operations going forward as well. So TCFD is becoming very much part of the DNA of the global financial markets. And it's really important for Africa, if it is to secure the levels of investment that it needs, that it actually takes advantage of TCFD so that it becomes an investable space, because this will become a differentiator going forward. That's the next slide, please. And two examples here of climate risk governance in Africa in operation. Well, one example particularly, but and that's from Absa Bank. The company resolved this year that it would provide stakeholders with an assessment of its exposure to climate change. It would include the quantum of its potential loans to, or its loans to carbon-related assets. A description of significant credit concentrations to carbon assets, and the financing of climate-related opportunities as well. And it set out a motivation to do this. Now, and what's one of the interesting things about that is actually that because they're a signatory to an initiative produced by the, or organised by the United Nations Environment Programme of Finance Initiative called the Principles for Responsible Banking, which itself draws on TCFD. It shows how TCFD is really creating change and making change. And it's been quite a remarkable process over the last 3 years since TCFD recommendations were published that this has happened. But there are other examples. Nedbank as well has had a shareholder resolution a resolution passed by its shareholders at AGM in 2020. So it now has a sustainable energy policy and a policy on disclosing fossil fuel linking, including to oil and gas projects. Investec has published a group fossil fuel policy, and again reiterated its commitment to TCFD. So you can see this sort of gradual movement forward that is really pervading into the financial services world. Sorry, and I think I'm going to hand over back to you, Robin, now at this point.
Thank you. Thanks, John, for taking us through that. We wanted to turn to an example of how one bank got started on climate risk analysis for the purposes of their TCFD work. And here we're going to look at an example from a Brazilian bank. So it's also an emerging economy bank, which is Itaú Unibanco. They're a bank in Brazil, as I said, and they participated in the UNEP-FI, which is a United Nations Environment Program TCFD pilot with 15 other commercial banks back in 2017 and 2018. Acclimatise and other consultants helped support this group of banks to develop an early methodology for analyzing physical climate risks and transition risks. And this example I'll talk you through is Itaú's early physical risk analysis in the agriculture sector. So you can see there's a set of steps. They took quite simplified steps listed out there. And first, they selected climate scenarios and time horizons, as well as a set of physical climate hazards. These covered incremental hazards, which in TCFD language, that's chronic hazards, and extreme events, which in TCFD language is acute hazards. The group in Acclimatise then had conducted a full literature survey of the existing climate impact studies on the agriculture sector. And we located studies which helped show how these climate hazards affect agricultural indicators like production levels, prices, and costs. Itaú then took the studies and the outputs that we found and evaluated how the credit quality for a sample of their clients would change. They did a representative sample of their clients, and they looked at how this credit quality would change due to these hazards under the scenarios they selected and the time periods they were after. So then also once they got the results, they extrapolated that back up to the full set of clients across their whole agriculture portfolio. So another thing I want to flag here is the wide range of teams that got involved in this exercise. So you see environmental risk experts, which were responsible for validating the methodology and coordinating. The sustainability team was involved, which was responsible for engagement with the working group, the Unipify working group. Portfolio managers were involved, who were responsible for data collection. Credit risk experts were involved as well, who were responsible for evaluating the impacts on clients' credit. And commercial staff were involved, who were responsible for technical aspects of the agriculture sector and getting data there. So it's just to show that it takes sort of an army to do this kind of analysis, and we do recommend that you look across your whole organization when you're getting started. Next slide. So this slide is, it shows a table with the results from Mitau's exercise. Looking at the second column from the left, this shows how the chronic hazards or extreme events changed revenues for their clients. And then the two columns to the right of that show how the acute hazards changed revenues and costs for their clients. These changes were all calculated as a change by 2040 from a current baseline. And the final column here shows Itau's qualitative assessment of the climate impact. So to reach this qualitative score, they calculated a climate adjusted balance sheet, or they projected a climate adjusted balance sheet. And they did this for the clients based on their actual balance sheet. So balance sheets were changed by the impacts resulting from the total physical risk, so the total of all three columns across chronic and acute hazards. And with the climate adjusted balance sheet, Itau calculated a projected credit rating and then compared that with the current credit rating, and that produced a qualitative sort of impact score. And yeah, essentially you can find this and other examples in the Unipify report called Navigating a New Climate. It's linked on this slide, and it's also linked in the resource table that I mentioned earlier, which will be at the back of this slide deck when we send it out. And this is just an early example of what physical risk analysis can look like for a certain sector and geography. So when you're getting started, it's about thinking about which sectors and geographies really matter to you and which could be good entry points for doing portfolio level analysis, and thinking about how to scale that down. So doing a representative sample, for example. And with these results, Itau is thinking now about making decisions about how to move forward. Sorry, I think someone's not on mute. And this can be either by engaging with certain clients on their adaptation plans and needs, or thinking about their overall investment or lending strategies in the agriculture sector going forward off the back of this exercise. Next slide. So a final slide for this session, we wanted to collate a set of networks that you can use to help you get started on TCFD. So these are mostly global networks, though some do have a regional presence. So the key one for us is Unipify, which is the initiative I was mentioning that Itau participated in. They've got working groups for banks, investors, and insurers. I think some of the folks on the call today are probably in the Unipify Phase 2 TCFD pilot. But if you're not already involved, it's really a great chance, and it's kind of a unique initiative that we see in the field. It's a chance to club together, really, and we don't really see a matched degree of collaboration and joint exploration of TCFD approaches. So Unipify really is our top recommendation. Another one to flag, though, is the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change. This is part of a group of global investor groups, a group of global investors. There are groups in North America, Asia, and Australia. And so the IIGCC is actually a European initiative, but we've seen several South African members already, and I think they're open to a wider membership. And it's a really good source of relevant literature and reports on climate risk, in particular for institutional investors. Next slide, please. So a final wrap up of session 2. We've seen that climate risk analysis, mandated climate risk analysis, is still emerging in the region, but that regulators have started to come together and started to recommend that guidance be developed. We see a lot of stakeholder action, and this includes shareholders, which are already asking for climate risk analysis and disclosure at AGMs. We also see stakeholders, including development banks, which are active in the region, will likely be expecting climate risk analysis in line with TCFD from you as a condition of their support. And essentially, we hope that we made the strong case that really getting started with TCFD enables you to get ahead of the curve in terms of eventual regulations and mandates that are coming. And we've seen several examples of financial institutions here proactively putting climate risk disclosure votes on their AGMs, and those are being passed. So we are seeing emerging peer action, and also there are networks for you to tap into to get started on TCFD to connect and learn from your peers. Next slide. Okay, so in the last session, we want to offer a refresher on the TCFD framework, and then we'll take you through an exercise where we'll send you some links and you can participate that way. So a refresher on TCFD. TCFD has a total of 11 recommendations across 4 pillars. The framework asks for corporates and financial institutions to disclose against these 4 areas, and it provides 11 detailed recommendations. But I think, as John mentioned, TCFD is much more than a set of recommended disclosures, and it really should be seen as a roadmap on how you can take action on climate risk management. So in particular, we want to draw attention to the 2 that are circled in red, governance and risk management, for the purposes of this exercise that we're going to do. And we think that the best way to get started with TCFD, as we mentioned in webinar 1, is the governance pillar. We think that the risk management pillar is also a good place to start, and there are things that you can set in motion here and get going on your climate risk and opportunity analysis. So I'll kind of talk you through these a little bit more here again before we move on to the exercise. Next slide. Under the governance pillar, the TCFD suggests organizations disclose their governance structures around climate-related risks and opportunities. But what does that mean for you, and how can this help you? Here, under the governance pillar, your organization needs to think about setting up proper roles and responsibilities for climate risk and opportunity management. And you need to think about the resources needed, including the skills and knowledge, as well as the time and the energy to manage climate risks. Here is where you'll ask yourself questions like, has the board identified climate risks as a relevant issue? Has the board identified an oversight role on climate risks? Has the board assigned clear roles and responsibilities for the identification, assessment, and management of climate-related risks and opportunities? And have escalation channels on climate risks been determined? Next slide. Turning to risk management, the risk management pillar, the TCFD here suggests that you should disclose how your organization identifies, assesses, and manages climate-related risks. But what does that mean, and how can that guide you? As part of your risk management work for TCFD, you need to begin to survey internal and external capacities needed for the analysis. This includes conducting a review of internal capacities and external providers for both physical and transition risk, and starting to build internal capacity around climate risk analysis. You also need to consider scenario analysis approaches for physical and transition risk, and you need to consider integrating climate considerations into your existing risk management frameworks. Next slide. So the risk management pillar suggests you need to think about which risk management approaches you will take. And this slide here sketches out what these can look like for physical and transition risk. So following your climate risk assessments for physical and transition risk, you can think about what the results mean for how you invest going forward. You can think about how you can engage with your clients on physical or transition risk. And as part of risk management, you can also invest in climate-related opportunities, thinking back to some of those examples of investment needs we mentioned earlier today. Next slide. The risk management pillar of TCFD also suggests you need to use scenario analysis in your risk assessments, and scenario analysis has become a buzzword, and so we want to kind of just demystify it a little bit here while we're thinking about scenario analysis and highlight a couple things to keep in mind when you're getting started with it. So selecting scenarios to use for physical risk analysis will be different than selecting scenarios for transition risk analysis. And it's important to note here that scenarios are not forecasts. They're storylines of plausible futures. So you need to select plausible futures for the types of risk you're assessing, and those will be different for transition and physical. Transition risk analysis will be, you'll be interested in climate scenarios that have a lower temperature, as this assumption means that more climate mitigation policies and technologies are rolled out, and therefore there is more transition risk. So this means selecting a 1.5 to 2 degrees scenarios, which is change in temperature versus pre-industrial levels. For physical risk analysis, you need to select scenarios where there's likely to be more physical risk, which is therefore scenarios with a higher temperature increase. And that means the 3 or 4 degree scenario. Next slide. So another thing to highlight here quickly is that apart from the fact that physical and transition risk analysis requires different ranges of temperature increases or different temperature scenarios, a key difference is that transition risk scenarios are often available off the shelf in sort of pre-constructed narratives. And this table here shares some of the families of transition risk scenarios available. This is important to note. This does not exist for the physical risk side. And instead, you need to select IPCC representative concentration pathways for your physical risk analysis. And the final slide touches on what we mean by RCPs. Next slide. Thank you. So RCPs are developed by scientists and they're known as representative concentrated pathways. They are a plausible range of future atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations, and they relate to an average change in global mean temperature. So for physical risk, you want to do 4 degrees, you want to do up to a 4 degrees scenario warming by 2100, which means that you'd select an RCP that relates to this as your high risk scenario, and that would be RCP 8.5. Good practice, so we also have another RCP highlighted here, RCP 2.6, and that's because good practice suggests to select a high and low risk scenario. So you also want to select something that corresponds to around 2 degrees, which is your low risk scenario, so that'd be RCP 2.6 roughly. And all of this here, all of this sort of discussion around scenario analysis, it is in the weeds, but it's just to highlight that when you do scenario analysis for physical and transition risk as part of your TCFD work, there'll be different approaches and decisions to make about the parameters of these exercises. And it's good to kind of be familiar with the early decisions that you'll typically need to think about when you're getting started with TCFD and climate risk analysis in the risk management pillar in particular. Next slide. So the last slide before we get to the exercise, the risk management pillar suggests that effective climate risk management requires integration of climate risks into the various elements of a risk management framework that you already have. So these are the sort of areas that you would need to integrate or think about how to integrate climate considerations into. Okay, and so that should give you a bit of a refresher on the two TCFD pillars that we think are good to get started with, which are governance and risk management. And now we will shift to the exercise and take a minute to get that set up for you. And I'll explain the instructions in just a minute. So Maya, have you got the links ready?
Yep.
Okay, so we are running just a couple minutes behind, so we'll have probably around 20 minutes for this exercise in total. You'll have around 15 minutes to work through a series of questions, which will be provided by a set of 3 links in the Zoom chat box. We ask that you only submit 1 response per exercise part. And the series of questions will ask you to think about mirror the 3 areas that we've included in these trainings. So the first part is what climate risks are relevant to your loans, holdings, or investments. The second part is why you should care about managing them. So which governance pressures are you facing? And the third part is how you can use the TCFD framework to get started in managing climate risks and thinking about governance and risk management pillar activities. So we will send you one link at a time and give you some time to finish that before sending you the next link. This will take you to a Google survey. We heard yesterday that some people were not able to open the Google link due to their security on their computers, but you're welcome to either private message us in the group chat or just put your responses in the group chat so that everyone can see. So moving to the first part, which is the what. We'll leave this slide up, but please follow the link that Maya just put in the chat to complete the Google form, and we'll check back with you in a couple minutes. Okay, great. So we're seeing some responses come in. Give you another minute to complete part one of the exercise. Okay, Maya, if you can move to the next slide. So Maya's put the link for part two, which is having you think about the why. So which market, regulatory, stakeholder, climate drivers are you already facing, or are there others? And we want you to think, if you're not facing any of the drivers that we list out in the exercise, have a think about which of these is most likely to emerge in your region in the coming few years. So please use the second link to complete this part. Thank you. All right, so we've got some responses, but take another minute to complete part 2. We will move slides, Maya, and release the link to the third part of the exercise, which we've given you long answer forms. So have a think about these questions in the form and take your time to answer those. We'll give you maybe a little bit less than 10 minutes. Thank you. Okay, so we'll give you a few more minutes to complete part 3. And another reminder we wanted to make was if you have any questions or thinking about anything you want to discuss around these questions we're asking you, then please just drop a note in the group chat and we'll pick that up in the discussion. Okay, in a last minute or so, do take your time because you can still be completing part 3 while we're discussing the results. Okay, so we've got just a couple responses rolling in still, but that's fine. Maya, if you can switch slides to the next slide. Bear with us for a moment. Okay, great. Thank you, Maya. So just starting to look at some of the first results from part 1, which is where we asked you to consider a potential focus of climate risk analysis. And we actually saw this yesterday as well. Looks like you are thinking about both physical and transition risks, which is good as the TCFD asks for both. Next slide. In thinking about physical risks, we asked you to select sort of the top 3 that were on your mind. And we see increasing temperatures, which is a chronic hazard, water stress, which is a chronic hazard, and an acute hazard, which is drought, those are the top selected. You see flooding also selected. These are good places to start. Next slide. And then selecting transition risk drivers that seemed relevant to you in terms of the top there, we see policy and regulation changes, so carbon or emission targets that are emerging as some of the ones that you listed as most motivational. Technology changes as well as the second one. And then moving to results from part 2, thinking about climate risk management drivers, so drivers of climate risk assessment or analysis that you're already facing. And it looks like we see, I think we asked folks to select their top 5. We see commitments to TCFD, to taking on the TCFD recommendations as a key driver. So that's really good news. That's where we want you to be. We also see oversight and pressure from financial supervisors listed there. And as well as stakeholders or your investors or banks asking for this or other stakeholders. And we did see some good evidence of that happening in South Africa in particular. And here we asked if you're not facing any of the drivers that we listed that you're aware of, if there are any that that seem relevant that may be emerging. Interestingly, we see physical evidence of the climate crisis. So we did see that in the South Asia region as well. So just sort of, it's front of mind for some folks. So that's putting climate risk analysis on the agenda as they experience these climate risks firsthand. That's interesting. And it looks like for some people, a commitment to TCFD recommendation may not be there right now, but you can see it coming. So that's really interesting as well as the increase in regulatory policies and emerging policies. Okay, so we've got just a handful of responses to the part 3 of the exercise, which is the long form answers on governance and risk management pillars of TCFD. I'm gonna switch to share my screen so we can all look at those together now, if you just bear with me. And Maya or John, if you can let me know if you can see my screen.
Yeah, I got that. Thank you.
Okay. Great. So looking first at the governance pillar, teams listed include legal, investment teams, compliance, investment officers, and I'm assuming this means energy and sustainability, environment and sustainability, or social. ESG folks, deal teams, ESG as well. So this does pick up on the point we were hoping to make, which is that it is good to have a really diverse team.
I think it also shows, Robin, that what we're talking about when we're talking about transition risk, physical risk, and obviously the opportunity to go against them, that they really do strike to the core of a business. They're not what you might call some sort of green flavoring environmental and social issue. These are hardcore business issues, and in order to deal with them, you need the real teams that actually run the business in a financial service company. So it is the deal teams, the investment committees, risk management, etc. So I think that's coming through quite nicely.
Absolutely. Looking at the question under the governance pillar about which board committees or subcommittees. So here we're trying to get you to think about what's the route to the board and how can they start to take responsibility. So it looks like we've got risk committees, sustainability committees, a range of other committees as well, which is.
And again, there, I think, everybody has risk, which, is right to the core of the business. But I think this importance of seeing this as a governance issue, if an organization doesn't have this identified as a core governance issue, then it's always difficult, as we all know, to drive something forward within a business. So having board level, not just approval, but absolute buy-in is very key to this whole process.
Definitely, and that touches on the next question, which is around
Yeah.
which senior manager could take responsibility. So this is definitely what we want to see, this kind of level of senior manager to really be the sponsor of this work in your organization, and that enables buy-in from lots of other teams that may not be immediately interested in climate, but having someone this senior can help motivate that. And here with this governance pillar question, we wanted you to kind of think about some of the speed bumps that you might face along the way, and also some of the things that might enable board oversight of climate risks.
Yeah, and just picking up on the, one or two people have talked about capacity and expertise, and I mean, nobody's asking financial services organizations to become climate scientists. You're expert in your area and you do what you do best. This is about tapping into knowledge and expertise that in some cases exists elsewhere. It can also be found in shared learning and knowledge through some of these wider initiatives, these peer group initiatives that we talked about, not just TCFD, but we talked about UNEP-FI, for example, and there are lots of others where your peers are talking to each other and beginning to share ideas and thoughts. So I think that's quite important. And it's also recognizing that, yes, there are expertise areas that you may well need to go outside your business to tap into and pull in.
Absolutely. And I thought this was an interesting one too, John. It is a very technical and time-consuming exercise, but maybe sweetening the deal by looking at the opportunity
Yeah.
elements, which is somewhat of a masterstroke of TCFD to actually include the opportunities, which may be more interesting or motivational in the beginning, to try and think about new markets and things and products and services that you can offer your clients and new clients related to climate.
Yeah, and when we think of something like renewable energy, where the opportunity to deliver both on the transition risk side, but at the same time deliver enormously on building resilience within Africa, so that it is in a better position to actually withstand a changing climate and greater economic development. That opportunity is really quite exciting, and it's through, we've felt for a long time that focusing on the opportunity actually helps you understand the risk as well. Whereas sometimes if you just focus on the risk, you're actually putting this into the too difficult box very quickly. So I think there is a plus side to the financial services world actually seeing this as where are those investment opportunities.
Yeah, and I'll just touch on it really quickly. So I mentioned the UNEP-FI report, Navigating a New Climate, and also we pulled the sort of structure of that methodology, but there is a methodology in that report for looking at opportunities and screening for them as well. So it's just a way to kind of make sense of the many different sort of venues and things where you can think about opportunities and have a way to structure your analysis as well. And that's a qualitative assessment that you can really get started with. It's pretty straightforward. Okay, so looking at the risk management pillar, we asked about internal capacities. I think John touched on this already. You will probably need some external support, but as one person flagged here, some internal capacity to do this analysis does exist. And that's interesting too, to see that there is commitment to growing the internal capacity. So in the short term, you may need to rely on more external support, but in the longer term, as this analysis gets going and established in your organization, it could be that with the right buy-in, you could start to build up your internal capacity. It's interesting to see here, one firm did say that they have internal capacities already, so that's really good news. And that this really does get at it here. It's a combination of both. There are some areas where we're seeing financial institutions really build up their expertise, and in particular around using GIS for physical risk analysis that allows you to layer and manipulate data in a geospatial environment. It's not typically a skill set that's seen within financial institutions, but we do see increasingly financial institutions are setting up teams that have that capacity, which enables you to carry out this risk analysis at your will, really. So here we are asking about thinking about climate scenario analysis. Under the TCFD, one of the purposes of it is to get the corporates and financial institutions to really think beyond the short-term time frame that kind of holds us back when thinking about climate. So it's asking for scenario analysis, but we wanted to hear what your thoughts were on looking beyond your normal investment and lending timeframes. So we're encouraged to see that, okay, so there are some long-term investors here, and some are saying maybe out to 15 years. And then another person here is saying, I'm not sure on how best to establish an appropriate time horizon that will be understood and accepted by the investment committee. I think I'm not sure, John, if you want to come in here, but I think in this, in getting started, there will be, they will need to give a little bit on this, in the sense that you will need to look further out, and the climate model projections look probably way further out than you're used to looking, at least for physical risk.
Yeah, and I think the other way to think about that is there is a lot of merit in doing an initial screening exercise to identify which investment, which parts of your portfolio or lending portfolio um, are more likely to have greater exposure and vulnerability. Then look at those a little bit more detail to try and understand what are the material, what are the timescales that are material to your investment and your lending decision making. I think trying to establish that. But there are, as we said earlier, there are ways of uh, not just relying on climate change model scenarios, which are longer term. There are ways of developing more near term focus on this. So yeah, but again, I think that's part of one of the things to discuss with advisors on that.
Absolutely. And okay, so for the sake of time, I'll be really quick, but there are, we know, some really good examples emerging of correlation analysis, which is what John's sort of alluding to. And that is, South African banks are doing that as part of the phase 2 of UNIPFI, and that will be published in the coming months. So there'll be published examples of that as well in the public domain of correlation analysis, which helps you look in the closer term. Here on the qualitative versus quantitative debate, we really just want to, so we see quantitative, qualitative, unsure, quantitative. This is the base assumption, and it is true that your sector and your industry is a quantitative industry, but with getting started on TCFD, it doesn't automatically require you to do quantitative analysis. I think actually we've seen a lot of sort of debate on this in this space over the last few years, and qualitative analysis is welcomed in your first go at this. So don't be put off if you're not able to quantify just yet. And finally, thinking about feeding this back. So this is a bit of a process and it will take time, but this is something we really want you to keep in mind as you're getting started. And I think with that, I will need to go back to the slides and just do a really quick wrap up because we've got one more minute.
Okay.
So I'll stop sharing. Maya, you can share again. So we didn't have a bunch of questions come through. We had, I think, 1 or 2 comments, which are, a comment that Investec had actually published a TCFD report, which is interesting. If you do have any questions, you can always reach out to CDC and we can answer them, or reach out to us. Next slide. Next slide. And in our very last minute here, we just want to touch back on our learning objectives. And again, we hope that we've made a really strong case for you to think about and engage with TCFD, and we hope that we've given you some good entry points, in particular the risk management and governance pillars of it, as well as a sort of foundation of what physical risks and what transition risks are in different areas that you operate. There is an extensive sort of resource list from the first webinar, as well as some more dedicated and regional resources in this slide deck. So do engage with those. And yeah, thank you for engaging, and we appreciate your time today. We'll leave it there.
Thank you.
Thank you.